When Jovan said it, he wasn't careless. He said it as if he'd offered me coffee. "You'll never get promoted, Angelina. Not with your background. Not here. People like you, they don't move up in places like this." He said it with that slow, satisfied smile that made my stomach hollow out. The room smelled like cheap cologne and stale coffee. His office had a window that looked over the parking lot, and a framed photo of himself shaking hands with someone important. He tapped a pen against a thick stack of performance evaluations as if I were a small, insignificant pebble he could nudge aside. This is the part where a lot of my friends told me to quit on principle. "Don't let him win," Mara texted. "File a complaint. Walk away." But Jovan didn't know what he was starting when he told me that sentence like a verdict. He didn't know that what he thought was a rumor of my limitations would turn into a blueprint for my life. "My name is Angelina. I'm 34, I live in the suburbs of Philadelphia, I have a rescue dog named Harper, and I spent 6 years at Langford & Pierce, a mid-size marketing firm, building myself out of grit and stubbornness. I started there as an account coordinator straight out of a small state college with a double major in communications and business. I worked late nights, learned to love spreadsheets, memorized client pitches, and swallowed every line of critique because I knew how to learn. I was careful, ambitious, and remarkably average at being modest. Jovan was different. He was the sort who wore tailored suits and told stories about being younger than everyone else in the room when he clinched a deal. He'd floated up through the company on what I later called charisma money. Bright jackets, golf club names, the ability to make people feel small and applaud him for it. I admired his confidence once. I admired the facade until it crushed me. He made his politics a punchline in the office. Always careful, always casual, never crossing what would trigger an HR email. But the racism was raw when it came to me. Not coded. Not a joke that he'd later claim was misconstrued. He said things I could prove he said. He said them to my face during meetings where folks laughed or looked away. He called my suggestions ambitious but unrealistic, and told me privately that we have to keep the client comfortable whenever I pushed for visibility. He told me I had a different cultural lens, so my strategic instincts were interesting, but not promotable. I kept the fear inside for a long time. It tasted like pennies and shame. I smiled and kept working. I made the numbers. I closed campaigns. I kept my calendar full and my head down. But every time a promotion announcement skipped my name despite the metrics that should have made it impossible to ignore, I felt the weight of that smile. I also felt something else, growing and steady, a plan. The first time I told someone what Jovan had said, it was my mother on the phone. "You deserve better," she said in her lilting voice that made everything softer. "But don't let them break your spirit." So I didn't. I started small and legal, documentation. The corporate world loves paper more than it loves decency. I saved emails. I started keeping a private folder of every interaction that felt like a nudge down instead of a lift up. Performance reviews where my numbers were the only thing acknowledged but spun into, "We need to develop X." Meetings where my ideas were ignored until a white colleague repeated them, and then they were great. And crucially, anything Jovan said that crossed the line. Not gossip. Not hearsay. Direct quotes. Dates. Witnesses. Time-stamped emails. I turned my outrage into files. At first it felt paranoid. I told myself I was overreacting. Then Jovan made a joke in a departmental meeting. "Promotions here are a meritocracy. If your last name ends with a vowel, you're already in the running." A few people laughed. I didn't. My fingers were cold on my laptop. I wrote down the quote in my folder and sent myself the file with a subject line. Save Jovan. Meanwhile, I began to understand a truth the company never advertised. Promotions weren't just about metrics. They were about narratives. You had to be the person who told the story the board wanted to hear. You had to be visible in the right rooms. You needed allies who liked your face and someone who would fight for you behind closed doors. Jovan had those allies, not because they loved him, but because he made them feel safe. He made them feel like winners. So I cultivated my own network. I stayed late in the meeting rooms not just to finish slides, but to listen. I learned people's priorities. Kevin in strategy had an obsession with analytics that bordered on religious. Priya in legal loved spreadsheets and gossip in equal measure. Mara, my best friend at work, knew how to make the C-suite laugh without losing her edges. I volunteered for projects that necessitated cross-department collaboration. I accepted the thankless tasks that let me work directly with the clients who mattered and the vendors that mattered. I made myself useful in ways that were visible. There were setbacks. A promotion I was promised evaporated when Jovan told the board we needed someone with the right image for a major account. Twice, he used the phrase, "we have to maintain cultural fit." Twice, my name vanished from the discussion. It stung. It also taught me how to move in silence. I enrolled in an executive program at a state university. Nights and weekends, 36 months of statistics and leadership courses that sharpened me and, importantly, the letters behind my name on LinkedIn. I took a certification in digital transformation that everyone thought was trendy and would pass. I made my resume heavy and indisputable. More importantly, I quietly started looking outward. It was the most difficult thing, letting go of the narrative that loyalty to a place that didn't value me was virtuous. I took networking coffee meetings with recruiters under the pretense of market research. I let the possibility of leaving hang like a new season of a show I couldn't stop watching. I didn't tell anyone at work. Not Mara. Not my mom. Not my boyfriend, who loved me but didn't entirely understand the politics of a place where smiles could be weapons. And then I found something I didn't expect. Allies who already knew Jovan's underside. Kevin had been passed over for a director role he should have had because Jovan wanted someone who fit better. A finance manager named Elena told me in a whispered conversation that HR had quietly mediated complaints against Jovan in the past. People had stories. They had bruises. And they had the thing that scared him the most: indifference when he was angry. I assembled these stories not into revenge but into truth. Lines of testimony that when triangulated would make a clear picture. The thing about corporate life is that everyone thinks they're bulletproof until the bullet is a spreadsheet and a subpoena. The part that surprised me was how human weakness, sex, ambition, the desire to be liked, would become my key. One Thursday night in late October, I stayed at the office late because a client had moved a deadline like a chess player adjusting to a new tactic. I wasn't supposed to be there. Harper would be waiting at home with that guilty look dogs get when you've been gone too long. My phone buzzed at 10:13 p.m., an unknown number. I almost ignored it. I answered. "Angelina? It's Priya. Are you still at the office?" "Yeah, working." I tried to sound casual. My throat felt like sand. "Be careful," she said. "Kevin's car is still out front." "Why?" I asked. Alarm prickled lower on my spine. Because I think Jovan and David from HR are here." My stomach dropped. David was the HR director. He'd been at Langford and Pierce for nearly 15 years. A man who'd built institutional knowledge and, more importantly, had the power to bury things. He was a kindly man at parties, the kind who laughed loudly at people's jokes and took photos with the interns. Privately, his decisions shaped people's livelihoods. If there was an affair between the person closest to hiring and the person charged with policing misconduct, that wasn't just spicy gossip. That was a conflict of interest. It was a lever. I walked to the elevator. My steps felt like they belonged to someone else. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to be professional. When I reached the top floor corridor by the conference rooms, the lights were dim. Voices leaked from the boardroom. A laugh. A clink of glass. I crept closer. I don't know what I expected. A whispering, a stern discussion, a curt professional exchange. What I found was a late-night tryst. Jovan and David in an intimate embrace, laughing in the bath of the projector's blue light. There was a wine-stained scarf on the back of a chair, and David's phone vibrated on the table with a calendar invite for a 1:1 salary review. Scheduled by David, accepted by Jovan. There were also documents fanned on the table with red lines that suggested Jovan had already proposed promotions, budget shifts, and personnel moves that benefited his favored staff. I stood frozen by the open door, not because I wanted to watch, but because my brain filed everything like evidence. I took pictures with my phone. I know that sounds like something from a movie, but I did because I knew how fast narratives could be rewritten, because I had been watching that happen to me. I took the pictures, breath trembling, and I left without making a sound. Over the next week, the office pulsed with the same uneasy hum you get before a storm. Jovan acted as if nothing had happened. He gave me a look once, a mixture of annoyance and slight suspicion, that should have been returned with a smile, but it wasn't anymore. I had the photos. Priya had witnessed me walk in and later admitted she saw too much. Elena in finance offered to pull payroll and compensation records. Kevin offered his notes. Now I had more than grievance. I had structural corruption and favoritism mapped across income statements. It was the perfect, ugly portrait of how someone could claw at power when given both the charm of charisma and the protection of HR. This was no longer only about me. It was about every person in the company who had been shaped by Jovan's decisions. But here's the catch. You don't expose a powerful man with photos and accusations alone without something that makes the board listen. The board listens to numbers, to risk. Men with reputations invest in companies. Investors back organizations that can be trusted. A scandal in a mid-size firm like ours would ripple outward. Client churn, stock dips for a parent company. Langford and Pierce was private but had public partners, legal exposure, and regulatory headaches. I needed to make it clear that this was not a private matter. It was a strategic risk. So I began the hard, meticulous work of building a case that would matter to people with spreadsheets instead of consciences. Elena pulled payroll anomalies. Kevin lent me his email threads where recommendations for promotions were rubber-stamped by absent decision-makers. Priya and Mara recorded notes about the timetable of promotions that lined up suspiciously with David's private meetings. I compiled everything into a dossier with a table of dates, names, events, and impact projections for client retention and revenue forecasting. I did the math on potential legal costs. I did what lawyers do when they want to make a problem look like a line item on a balance sheet. Quantify the risk. I didn't file an HR complaint. I prepared for the moment when I would hand the dossier not to HR, but to someone who had to act on strategic risk. I reached out to an old mentor, Renee, a former executive who now served on several boards, and asked for advice. She read the dossier and didn't blink. "This will take a new voice," she said. "You need someone who can get a board to sit up. People like Jovan survive internal investigations because their networks protect them. You need to out-network him." She was right. My next move had to be not just exposing him, but rendering him powerless in the environment where he had spent years making himself untouchable. The plan that followed was not cinematic. It was 1,000 small, patient decisions that added up to a hard, clean resentment. I started interviewing, not to threaten Langford and Pierce, but because I had to know my market value. 2 companies expressed interest. One was a direct competitor, a larger agency with a reputation for strong leadership and a better diversity record. The other was a tech firm building an in-house creative team. Both offered promises and possibilities. The tech firm loved my transformation presentation. The competitor was impressed by the client retention figures I managed. The offers and the negotiations became a currency I hadn't had before: leverage. I took the job at the larger competitor, Mason & Frost, as Senior Director of Client Strategy. It meant a raise, a title that announced my arrival, and a seat where I could influence the very clients Jovan coveted. But mostly it gave me a new platform and time. I left Langford and Pierce with a carefully worded resignation letter and a polite smile. I didn't burn bridges. I folded them neatly and walked. At Mason & Frost, I built teams and took clients. I learned how to be at the top of my field without the noise of fighting for the scraps Jovan threw. I also kept my dossier on Langford and Pierce updated. I did not act rashly. I was patient. Opportunistic, yes, but also strategic. I took on clients who had relationships with Langford and Pierce. I did not poach, that would have been petty. Instead, I demonstrated what a well-managed client relationship looked like, and the clients noticed. They were the same people who had been on the receiving end of Jovan's occasional charm and thin strategies. They appreciated the steadiness I brought. One morning at a breakfast panel, I ran into Renee again. She smiled, slightly wicked now, the way mentors do when their student starts to play the game well. "How's the dossier?" she asked. "Updated," I said. "But I haven't decided what to do." "Good. Because an opportunity's coming." She didn't need to explain. 2 months later, Renee called with an offer that sounded like destiny wrapped in corporate speak. A private equity group that had acquired a controlling stake in Langford and Pierce was looking to bring in new leadership to reposition the firm. They were courting a seasoned COO to lead a digital overhaul. They were interviewing candidates. Their message: Langford and Pierce needs transformation. There was also an opening on the board they were putting together, and they were considering external candidates. Their priorities were risk mitigation, reputation cleansing, and growth. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jovan's garden of favors had bloomed for him, but the board had changed. Investors were tired of charismatic rot. They wanted measurable change. They wanted a candidate who could walk in with both the numbers and the story of how to rebuild trust. I flew back to town. I met with the private equity partners. I laid out a plan that was not about revenge but about value. I told them, plainly, that too many companies confuse product with people. I told them that I had both a plan to stop client churn and an awareness, from the inside, of structural risks that needed to be addressed. I did not present the dossier as a bitter weapon. I presented it as a risk assessment. There's a man in your organization, I said without naming names initially, whose personal entanglements with HR and favor dispensing have created legal exposure and client risk. You should know this before it becomes public. They asked questions. I answered. They said they would look into it. 2 weeks later, I received an offer I didn't expect, CEO in waiting. They wanted me to take the COO role with a fast track to a CEO transition, or take a seat on the board and run transformation. The wording was cautious but clear. We need someone who can fix this. Here's where I made what some might call the coldest part of the plan. I accepted with one condition. I wanted operational control and authority over HR decisions and reporting lines. I wanted the ability to reorder leadership to create transparency. I wanted the power to affect compensation and promotions directly. They agreed. They were investors. They favored results and timelines. I returned to Langford and Pierce not as a defeated account coordinator, but as a leader with a mandate. The first week was surreal. My former colleagues greeted me with a mixture of curiosity and a dawning hope. Mara hugged me like I'd returned from war. Kevin looked at me like a man who had just found an ally with teeth. Jovan watched me like a man who'd been blindsided by a chess move he hadn't seen. I don't relish saying what happened next like it's the satisfying click of a movie. It felt messy and righteous and utterly corporate. We opened an investigation. The private equity group brought in external counsel. The moment it began, people started to talk. David in HR was placed on leave, quietly but decisively. The board audited promotion decisions, compensation packages, and HR processes. My dossier, plus the external counsel's findings, made a clear picture. There were conflicts of interest, irregular salary changes, and patterns of favoritism that rose above the threshold for negligence. The legal risk was real. Our clients were given the option to audit their contracts and relationships. Some left. Many stayed because they trusted the new leadership's promise to fix the rot. Jovan's defenses were public-facing charm and private networks. Those defenses melted when external counsel offered precise findings and recommendations. The investors wanted clean books and a leadership team that could defend their value. Jovan had neither. He was demoted from VP of Client Services to manager-level advisory, pending further HR review. He had to hand over his email and calendar. For a week, he tried to be the same man, belligerent, indignant, mildly theatrical. He insisted his conduct was misinterpreted. He wanted the meeting where he would be vindicated. He asked me once in the hallway, voice low, eyes flinty, "Angelina, did you really come back to destroy me?" I remember my reply clearly. I looked at him as if he was an insect trapped under a jar. "No," I said. "I came back to make sure we don't have people like you deciding other people's livelihoods." That line stunned him more than anything. Until that point, he had assumed he'd be playing the puppet master forever. Having the strings cut was a new, unfamiliar sensation. After the investigation, things didn't just snap into place like a fairy tale. There were resignations, legal filings, and messy personal costs. David resigned with a severance and a confidentiality clause. Legal counsel negotiated settlements with a few staff members who had complaints, and the company instituted a new HR oversight structure with external auditing. We implemented transparent promotion panels. We created a rotation system for evaluators. We tracked diversity and inclusion metrics in the way we tracked revenue. We did the structural things that mean change endures beyond the optics. My promotion to COO, and eventual CEO a year later, felt less like a coronation and more like a responsibility. The private equity group kept me honest with quarterly check-ins that were frank and unforgiving. The board wanted results. I had the title that sent Jovan's jaw to the floor, but the real victory was in the change we implemented. A place where promotions were documented, where HR decisions were externally reviewed, and where the people once ignored had a process to speak and be heard. Jovan left the company 8 months after the investigation. He'd been offered a position at a small boutique firm that didn't ask many questions. He took it. I didn't gloat when the press release went up. I didn't post about it. There were some nights where the old rage came back raw, the kind that makes you replay every slight until your teeth ache. But those nights passed faster than they used to. The personal costs were real. Some colleagues who were close to Jovan found their careers stalled because they had been associated with him. Others felt vindicated. Mara stayed. She became my chief communications officer. Kevin became head of strategy. Elena took a leave to think about teaching. The office, as an organism, healed but with scars as humans do. There were awkward conversations at holiday parties. There were groceries and brunches and layoffs and celebrations intermingled. It is, as you see, the human thing, messy, imperfect, occasionally cruel. I wanted to make sure the end wasn't just an old man's quiet professional death. I wanted to make sure the system changed. To that end, I instituted training on bias with measurable consequences. We brought in anonymous reporting with verifiable follow-up. We set up a rotating promotion committee with external observers. We created an annual integrity audit that the PE firm had to sign off on. Those things were less flashy than firing a man who used a smile like a weapon, but they were harder to undo. The day I sat in Jovan's old office for the first time as CEO, the room felt different. The framed photo of him shaking hands was still on the shelf, but I added other photos. Team retreats, smiling faces from our community outreach, graphs showing improved retention. I did not remove his things. Power, I had learned, was better used than displayed. People ask me if I regret anything. Sometimes I do. I regret the nights of sleeplessness when I thought I might be ruining my life by suing for justice, or by leaving the safe familiarity of a place that loved its own myths. I regret the friendships strained because people chose comfort over courage. But I do not regret fighting. If there is a dirty secret, besides Jovan's behavior, it's that revenge isn't a dramatic montage leading to the villain's public humiliation. It is almost always slow, tedious, and procedural. It is building a resume that makes you impossible to ignore. It is turning hurt into something useful. It is making sure the boardroom cares before it is too late. In the months after, clients came to me and said the thing I had wanted to hear. We didn't know it was this bad. Thank you for taking care of it. That's the line that made my chest lighter. That's the line that made me understand this wasn't only personal victory. It was a safety net for people who would have come later, young women who would have swallowed the same insults, interns who thought no one would listen. To be beautiful in victory feels wrong sometimes. To make something safer for others felt right. And Jovan? I ran into him at a small industry event 2 years later. He introduced me as an old friend. He smiled with the same practiced charm. I listened politely. He asked if we'd ever collaborate. I said no and meant it. On my way home that night, Harper asleep in my passenger seat, I thought of the moment in the boardroom when I first heard that line. People like you, they don't move up. I thought of how that sentence had once been a weight and how, now, it was a mile marker. I had turned it into a momentum I could use because I refused a simpler reaction. I refused to let anger be the only thing I made. There is a quiet pride in walking through an office where people don't have to hide the fever in their voices. There is an unquantifiable joy in meetings where someone more junior speaks up and is listened to without the usual filters. That ultimately is the revenge that matters. It's the slow, structural one that reshapes who gets to have power. The truth is, I never wanted revenge to be my legacy. I just wanted fairness. But life, and men like Jovan, have a way of turning fairness into a battlefield. When the smoke cleared, when the investigations were old news, and when people stopped whispering my name like it was both a warning and a prayer, something unexpected happened. Peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't need applause or headlines. 6 months into my tenure as CEO, Langford and Pierce felt like a different company. Not perfect, no company ever is, but awake. People laughed more in meetings. HR's door stayed open. Promotions went to people who earned them, and not the ones who golfed on weekends. And for the first time in my career, I walked through the lobby and saw interns who looked like me, wide-eyed, nervous, hopeful. And I didn't feel that lonely echo I used to. One of them, a young woman named Simone, stopped me in the elevator one morning. "Ms. Angelina?" she said, clutching her notepad. "Yes. I just wanted to say thank you. My mentor told me about what you did, how you changed things here." Her voice was small but steady. I smiled at her, a little stunned. "You don't need to thank me," I said. "Just do your job well. And when it's your turn, make sure the door stays open for the next person." That night, when I drove home, I realized something simple but profound. Revenge, when done right, doesn't end with your enemy's fall. It ends with your world's rise. Still, sometimes memories returned. Sometimes I still saw Jovan's smirk in my dreams. That moment in his office when he told me I'd never get promoted because of my background. I used to replay that line over and over, trying to understand what made him so certain of his own superiority. Now, I think I finally know. People like Jovan thrive on fear. They thrive on the idea that the system will protect them, that silence will keep them comfortable. When you remove that silence, when you expose them with facts, with progress, with competence, you take away the only thing that ever made them powerful: intimidation. He'd tried to make me smaller. Instead, he'd built the woman who outgrew him. It's strange how much power a single sentence can have in your life. For years, I carried his words like a curse. But standing now at the top, not out of ego, but out of earned authority, those words have become a reminder of why I will never use my voice to shrink someone else. I visit my mom every Sunday. She always makes tea the same way, strong and sweet, and she asks about work even though she doesn't understand half of what I do. One evening, as I told her about a new diversity scholarship we'd set up in the company's name, she smiled at me and said, "You turn the hurt into harvest, baby. That's what our people do." And I think about that a lot, how revenge and healing can come from the same seed, just watered differently. A year later, I got an anonymous envelope at my office. Inside was a single printed email chain, a recommendation letter Jovan had written for a job application. At the bottom, his note read, "Angelina Grant is one of the most capable, intelligent leaders I've ever worked with." No signature, no explanation, but I laughed for a long time. Because that was it, the final irony. The man who once said I'd never move up now used my name as his reference point for excellence. And that, I suppose, is the most poetic ending I could have asked for. Langford and Pierce is now one of the few mid-size firms publicly reporting its diversity and equity metrics, something unheard of 5 years ago. We mentor underrepresented students in marketing and communications. We partner with local schools to sponsor internships for kids who would never have walked through our glass doors otherwise. Sometimes I see Jovan's name pop up in the industry news. He gives the occasional quote about modern leadership. He still dresses too sharply for the roles he holds. But every time I see it, I feel nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just distance. Because revenge, I learned, doesn't need an audience. It just needs to work. And it did.